Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we begin a journey into one of the most dramatic, treacherous, and fascinating reigns in history, the story of Elizabeth Tudor, the woman who would become Elizabeth II of England. Her life was not just about crowns and courtly splendor. It was a tale of danger, betrayal, and relentless struggle for survival. Elizabeth was born in 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. At first, her arrival was a bitter disappointment to her father, who had broken from the Catholic Church and risked everything in hopes of securing a male heir. The child he received instead was a girl, an innocent who carried on her tiny shoulders the weight of dynastic ambition and political upheaval. Her early years were marked by tragedy and blood. When Elizabeth was only 2, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed on charges of adultery and treason, a political move more than a crime. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title as princess, and pushed to the margins of the royal family. For most children, this would have been the end of any claim to greatness. But for Elizabeth, it was the beginning of a lifelong lesson, that survival in a world of power meant constant vigilance and unshakable resilience. As she grew, Elizabeth learned to hide her thoughts behind careful words and to mask her fears with composure. She was highly intelligent, receiving a first-class education in languages, philosophy, and the classics, equipping her to navigate the ruthless political stage of Tudor England. Every day of her childhood carried the shadow of suspicion. She was the daughter of a disgraced queen, yet also a potential heir to the throne. Her youth was a crucible of danger and betrayal, a stage set for the trials that would define her reign. Elizabeth's childhood was dangerous enough, but her teenage years and early adulthood were even more perilous. In the Tudor court, survival was a game of suspicion, betrayal, and shifting alliances, and one wrong step could send even a royal to the executioner's block. When her father, Henry VIII, died in 1547, Elizabeth's half-brother, the young Edward VI, became king. Though still a child, Edward's reign was dominated by powerful regents, and Elizabeth lived cautiously at the edges of power. Her education continued, and her sharp mind was admired by tutors and diplomats alike. Yet her position was never secure. She was not the favored heir, but she remained too important to ignore. Things grew darker when her half-sister Mary took the throne after Edward's death. Mary was a devout Catholic who sought to restore England to Rome, and Elizabeth, a Protestant, became the focus of constant suspicion. Whispers of plots swirled around her, and whether she was involved or not didn't matter. Her very existence made her a threat. In 1554, after a failed rebellion against Mary known as Wyatt's Rebellion, Elizabeth was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Imagine the fear, walking past the same walls where her mother had been executed 2 decades earlier, knowing that her life hung by a thread. For weeks, she lived in the tower, uncertain if each day would be her last. Yet, she survived. Lack of evidence, and Mary's own reluctance to execute her sister spared Elizabeth. She was eventually released, but even then, she lived under house arrest for a time, watched closely. Her every move weighed against the crown's suspicion. These years forged Elizabeth into steel. She learned the art of patience, the necessity of silence, and the power of appearances. She realized that in a kingdom ruled by suspicion, survival meant becoming a master of self-control. By the time fate placed the crown on her head in 1558, Elizabeth was no naive princess. She was a survivor who had faced the shadow of the axe and endured. When Queen Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth was summoned to take the throne. At just 25 years old, she inherited a kingdom divided by religion, weakened by years of turmoil, and threatened by enemies on every side. To the outside world, her coronation looked like triumph. But for Elizabeth herself, the crown was not only a prize, it was a burden that could cost her life. The people of England greeted her as a savior. After years of Mary's bloody persecution of Protestants, Elizabeth appeared as a figure of hope and renewal. Yet behind the cheers in the streets lurked deep divisions. Catholics considered her illegitimate, since her mother's marriage to Henry VIII had been annulled by the Church. Powerful nations like Spain and France watched closely, some already plotting to use religion as a weapon against her. Elizabeth understood immediately that her reign would be a tightrope walk. She restored Protestantism, but carefully, enough to stabilize her kingdom without sparking outright rebellion from Catholics. This balancing act became the hallmark of her rule. She presented herself as a queen of moderation, the virgin queen who embodied both strength and purity. But beneath the surface, every decision was calculated for survival. Marriage was one of her greatest political weapons. Monarchs across Europe sought her hand, each proposal carrying the weight of alliances and potential wars. But Elizabeth refused to marry, knowing that any husband, whether English or foreign, would risk dividing the realm or undermining her authority. Instead, she used the possibility of marriage as a bargaining chip, dangling it before kings and princes but never surrendering her independence. From the very start, Elizabeth's reign was under siege by Catholic plots, foreign powers, and even doubts within her own court. But she faced them with a steady hand, sharp intellect, and the hard lessons of her youth. Her crown was made of gold, yes, but it pressed like thorns into her brow. Every day, her survival depended not only on her wits, but on her ability to outplay enemies who waited patiently for her downfall. If Elizabeth was the crowned Queen of England, Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the shadow that haunted her reign. The two women were cousins by blood, queens by right, and rivals by destiny. Their intertwined stories would become one of the most dramatic power struggles in European history. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not, a Catholic queen with an unbroken claim to legitimacy in the eyes of Rome. To many Catholics in England, Elizabeth was a heretic and a usurper, while Mary was the rightful heir. This made Mary not just a rival monarch, but a living threat to Elizabeth's throne. When Mary fled Scotland after a disastrous reign and sought refuge in England in 1568, Elizabeth faced a dilemma. To offer sanctuary was an act of kinship, but to allow Mary freedom was to invite rebellion. So Elizabeth chose a middle path. Mary would be honored as a guest, but kept as a prisoner. For nearly 2 decades, Mary lived under Elizabeth's watch, moved from one castle to another, surrounded by guards but cloaked in a veneer of dignity. Yet confinement did not silence her. From her chambers, Mary became a rallying point for Catholic plots. Letters were smuggled out, conspiracies formed, and assassins whispered of striking Elizabeth down to place Mary on the throne. Each plot uncovered tightened the noose around Mary's fate. Elizabeth was cautious, reluctant to spill royal blood. She understood that executing Mary would set a dangerous precedent. If one queen could be killed, so could another. But as the years passed and as plots grew bolder, including the infamous Babington plot of 1586, Elizabeth's patience wore thin. The two queens never met face to face, yet their lives were bound together in a deadly dance of power and betrayal. Elizabeth ruled England with vigilance. Mary languished in captivity with ambition. One queen held the crown, the other held the hopes of Elizabeth's enemies. Their struggle was not just personal, it was the soul of England itself, torn between Protestant and Catholic, between old loyalties and new order. For nearly 20 years, Elizabeth kept Mary Stuart alive, torn between mercy and necessity. Mary was family, a fellow queen, and a woman who had suffered her own share of misfortune. Yet she was also the beating heart of every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth, a constant reminder that many in England and across Europe saw Elizabeth as nothing more than a pretender. The breaking point came in 1586 with the Babington plot. A group of Catholic conspirators, encouraged by foreign powers, planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Letters intercepted by Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, revealed Mary's approval of the plot. It was the evidence Elizabeth had avoided for years, the proof that her cousin was not just a passive figurehead for rebellion, but an active participant in treason. Elizabeth agonized over the decision. To execute Mary was to kill a fellow anointed monarch, something almost unheard of in the sacred traditions of kingship. She feared the political consequences, the wrath of Catholic Europe, and even the judgment of God. Yet to spare Mary was to invite her own death. In February 1587, the order was finally signed. Mary was brought to Fotheringhay Castle, dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom, and faced her end with remarkable composure. Witnesses recorded her prayers, her dignity, and her unshakable Catholic faith. When the axe fell, it was not just the death of a queen, it was the severing of a living symbol of resistance against Elizabeth's rule. Elizabeth's reaction was complex. She claimed afterward that the execution had been carried out against her wishes, perhaps as a way of softening the outrage, but whether she admitted it or not, the decision had been hers. Mary's death rid Elizabeth of her most dangerous rival, but it also haunted her, a reminder of the brutal choices that power demanded. With Mary gone, Elizabeth stood more secure than ever before. Yet her enemies abroad, particularly Catholic Spain, saw the execution as an unforgivable crime. The storm clouds of war gathered, and the greatest test of Elizabeth's reign was about to begin. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent shockwaves across Europe. For Catholic monarchs, especially King Philip II of Spain, it was the final insult. England's Protestant queen had not only defied Rome, but had shed the blood of a Catholic queen in the process. The time for patience was over. Philip would bring war to Elizabeth's doorstep. The plan was grand: a massive armada of more than 130 ships, carrying soldiers, supplies, and the weight of Catholic vengeance. Its mission was to rendezvous with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and then sail across the Channel to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. To many in Europe it seemed inevitable. How could a small, fractious island stand against the mightiest naval empire of the age? Elizabeth's court was tense. Some urged her to flee inland, to hide behind England's castles and fortresses, but Elizabeth refused to vanish from sight. Instead, she made one of the most iconic appearances of her reign at Tilbury, dressed in armor, addressing her troops with words that would echo through history. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was more than rhetoric. It was theater, designed to inspire courage at a moment when England's very survival was at stake. And it worked. Morale soared, and the English navy, smaller but nimbler than the Spanish behemoths, prepared for battle. When the Armada finally sailed in 1588, nature itself seemed to favor Elizabeth. English fireships scattered the tightly packed Spanish fleet, and storms in the Channel and North Sea turned the invasion into chaos. By the end, barely half the Armada limped home, battered and broken. What had been planned as a holy crusade ended as a humiliating defeat. For Elizabeth, it was the crowning triumph of her reign. The threat of invasion had united her fractured kingdom, and her defiance at Tilbury transformed her from a controversial ruler into a near mythical figure, the Virgin Queen, protector of Protestant England. But the victory was not just about ships and storms. It symbolized Elizabeth's resilience, the ability of one woman, underestimated and doubted all her life, to stand against the most powerful empire of her time and emerge unbroken. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked the high point of Elizabeth's reign, but triumph carried its own burdens. In the years that followed, cracks began to show beneath the glittering facade of the Virgin Queen. England remained in constant tension. Wars drained the treasury, famines spread misery, and rebellions erupted in Ireland that seemed endless and costly. Elizabeth's once youthful charisma, which had dazzled courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike, was beginning to wane. Her famously fiery temper grew sharper, and her circle of advisors shrank as age and intrigue claimed her most trusted allies. The greatest wound of her later years came from betrayal. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, had once been Elizabeth's favored courtier, a man she doted upon, perhaps even loved in her own guarded way. But Essex was reckless, ambitious, and impatient with the cautious politics of his aging queen. When he led a failed campaign in Ireland and then attempted a desperate coup in London, Elizabeth was forced to sign his death warrant. Watching him executed was not merely the loss of a subject, it was the loss of someone who had embodied her fading hopes of loyalty and youth. As the 1590s turned to the new century, Elizabeth became a living legend within her own lifetime. Plays, portraits, and poetry praised her as Gloriana Astrea, the eternal virgin who embodied England itself. Yet behind palace walls, the queen was often isolated. She painted her face with heavy white makeup to conceal the ravages of time, wore elaborate wigs to hide thinning hair, and clung to ceremony as a shield against decline. Still, she ruled with iron will. Foreign powers who had once predicted her downfall now treated her as a figure of awe, even as her kingdom strained under debt and hardship. Elizabeth outlasted rivals, rebellions, and conspiracies, but in the end, time itself proved her final enemy. In March 1603, after more than 4 decades on the throne, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She left no husband, no children, and no direct heir of her own bloodline. Yet she left behind something far greater. A legacy of defiance, survival, and power carved out in a world that had never believed a woman could rule at all. Elizabeth II's reign stands as a paradox, a time of glittering triumph and profound loneliness, of unity forged under a queen who ruled by division, and of greatness achieved at the cost of personal sacrifice. She was both a master of survival and a prisoner of her own myth. History remembers her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who outwitted assassins, crushed armadas, and turned a fragile realm into a rising power. Yet behind the jeweled gowns and the masks of ceremony lived a woman who bore the weight of solitude. She denied herself marriage and heirs not because she lacked passion, but because she knew that her body could never belong to both a husband and a kingdom. Elizabeth's story forces us to confront an eternal truth: that power is never free. Every victory she claimed carried an unseen cost. Alliances lost, lives sacrificed, loves betrayed, and the quiet erosion of self beneath the crown. And so we are left with a question that lingers far beyond her age. Is greatness worth the loneliness it demands? Or is the true measure of power the ability to remain human while holding it?